In January 2026, a far-left group, acting in the name of climate activism, the Vulcan Group, set fire to Berlin's power grid in the middle of winter. Their stated target: the fossil fuel infrastructure that Germany's energy transition was supposed to have replaced by now. The government calls it terrorism, but here is the question: how does the most ambitious climate program in history end up making energy more expensive and the grid more fragile, all at the same time? This is not an attack on Germany. I say this with genuine respect for a people known across the world for their discipline, their seriousness, their commitment. That is precisely what makes this story important and uncomfortable. We live in an age where every analysis is immediately reduced to an act of faith or heresy. This channel rejects that. What you're about to see is not an exercise in catastrophism, nor is it denial. It is an attempt to look at the interplay between energy, finance, and the physical constraints of our world. To be clear, responding to climate change is a necessity that demands a rational transition, but we have allowed a dangerous shift in how we approach this challenge. Where energy was once a public good, managed for the stability of the nation, it has increasingly become a financial asset. By creating complex energy systems as mere tools for guaranteed private returns, and by forcing intermittent renewables to act as a total solution rather than a component, we have created a fragile architecture. An architecture that risks undermining the very transition it was meant to achieve. If a nation with Germany's resources and determination can fall into this trap, the flaw is not in the execution, it is in the premise. This is the story of what happens when financial logic and political convenience try to override the systemic reality of energy, and why the bill always comes due. The story begins in 1986. Chernobyl turns nuclear safety from a technical debate into a national trauma across Europe. In Germany, that fear becomes a foundational political force. 10 years later, reunification forces the country to absorb East Germany's energy infrastructure, built almost entirely on lignite, the dirtiest fuel in existence. At this exact moment, the scientific consensus on climate change is hardening. Germany sees a historic opportunity to lead the world toward a new industrial era. This was the birth of the Energiewende. It wasn't just a policy, it was a bet on a total transformation. An 80 to 95% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and a transition to 80% renewable electricity. To achieve this, Germany committed to a double exit, decoupling the world's fourth largest economy from both carbon and nuclear power simultaneously. In 1991, Germany enacted the world's first national green electricity feed-in tariff, later perfected in 2000, guaranteeing returns on renewable investment. In 2011, after the Fukushima Daiichi accident, the nuclear phase-out was accelerated, despite growing concerns about grid stability. In March 2024, Germany's Federal Court of Auditors, the Bundesrechnungshof, published a devastating special report on the Energiewende. Its conclusions were precise. Grid expansions alone will require over 460 billion euros by 2045. Congestion management is already costing 6.5 billion euros per year. And the court stated explicitly that the government had created, outside specialist circles, a false picture of the actual costs of the transition. When the ministry was asked why proper environmental monitoring had never been established, its answer was remarkable in its honesty. The problem was not insufficient data, it was, in the ministry's own words, political enforceability. And in January 2026, an environmental group set fire to Berlin's power grid to protest the very system that was supposed to save them. Something went definitely wrong. And as you will see, the structural conditions that produced this failure are not only still in place, they are deepening. To find the key to this dilemma, let's now turn to the data. This graph shows the installed electricity generation capacity in Germany from 2002 to 2025. Please note, this graph doesn't show the electricity actually produced, but the maximum potential output of German power plants under ideal conditions. For each year, there are two columns. The one on the left indicates conventional power plants. The one on the right indicate renewable energy plants. Note how the installed capacity of renewables increases over the years, the right column, and how in parallel the conventional one decreases, albeit more slowly. The acceleration happens especially after 2011, following the Fukushima Daiichi accident. Onshore wind is the light green one, solar is yellow. In 2002, total installed capacity was 115.7 gigawatt. In 2025, it reached 271.8, an increase of 134.9%, with 156.1 gigawatt added. The data comes from the Fraunhofer Institute, the largest renewable energy research institute in Europe. Now, if Germany has more than doubled its total installed capacity, how much has electricity production actually increased? Let's move to the next graph. Here, you can see that, setting aside the peak reached in 2016 and 2017, production in 2025 is actually lower than in 2002. It goes from 544.2 terawatt hour to 478.7. The 2026 figure is partial. This graph speaks for itself, but it becomes clearer when you compare the two side by side. The reason comes down to something called the capacity factor, and it is simpler than it sounds. Imagine a factory that could theoretically run 24 hours a day. The capacity factor tells you how many of those hours it actually runs. A nuclear plant runs continuously. Its capacity factor is above 90%. Onshore wind turbines in Germany average around 25 to 30%, meaning they produce at full power 6 to 8 hours per day. Solar panels in Germany runs at around 10%, 2 hours and a half per day on average, because the sun doesn't always shine, and when it does, it isn't always strong enough, especially in Germany. This matters enormously when you are building an energy system. A gigawatt of nuclear capacity and a gigawatt of solar capacity look the same on paper, but they behave completely differently. I have already shown you many numbers and I don't want to overwhelm you with data, but I did run the calculations and I'm sharing the formula so anyone interested can replicate them independently. The result? Well, Germany went from a system capacity factor of 53.69% in 2002 to 20.10% in 2025. Literally, like going from power plant that work roughly once every 2 days to once every 5 days. But the problem runs deeper than that. When there is little sun and little wind, Germany, despite all its installed capacity, falls back on gas and coal. When that is not enough, it even imports electricity from its neighbors. When there is too much renewable production, the opposite happens. The internal grid cannot absorb the surplus, and neither can the grids of neighboring countries. Grid operators are then forced to shut down power plants, wasting electricity to avoid the risk of blackouts or infrastructure damage. The result, across Northern Europe, has been years of violent price swings, near zero or even negative wholesale prices when Germany floods the market, and sharp spikes when Germany needs to import. There is also a geographic problem. The highest concentration of energy-intensive industry is in the south. Wind turbines are in the north. Germany still hasn't built a sufficiently efficient transmission network to connect the two. And then there is the bill that German households receive every month. Germany has the highest household electricity prices in Europe and among the highest in the world. But less than half of that bill reflects the actual cost of energy. The rest is a layering of grid costs, state levies, and a 19% VAT on top of everything else, including the taxes themselves. A tax on taxes. Now, why doesn't an abundance of renewables with near zero marginal production costs translate into lower prices? This is the part that is genuinely counterintuitive, and it is worth slowing down for a moment. The European electricity market operates on a system called marginal pricing, or pay as clear. Every hour, the price of electricity is set by the last and most expensive unit needed to meet demand. When Germany's solar and wind produce abundantly, that price can drop to zero or even go negative. But the moment production falls short and gas plants must be switched on to fill the gap, those gas plants set the price for every single kilowatt hour on the market that hour, including the ones produced by wind and solar at near zero cost. Gas plants sit idle for most of the year, but they must recover their fixed costs. Construction, maintenance, personnel, in the few hours they actually run. So when they run, the price spikes. In short, this is a doom loop. The more renewables you add without solving storage, the more you depend on gas to fill the gaps, and the more gas dictates the price. But what does this mean in practice for the families paying those bills? And how does Germany compare to a country that made completely different choices? This is Eurostat data on household electricity prices, including all taxes, the final price. The data covers the period from 2007 to 2025. Let's compare Germany with France, an emblematic case given how differently the two countries have approached their energy systems. In 2007, Germany paid 21 cents per kilowatt hour, France 12, a gap of 72%. By 2025, Germany is at 38 cents, France at 26. The gap has narrowed somewhat, but the core reality remains. German electricity costs have become truly exorbitant. The truly remarkable aspect of this story, however, is what comes next. Look at this map from Electricity Maps. After hundreds of billions spent, Germany is now one of Europe's worst performers when it comes to CO2 emissions in the electricity sector. Depending on the hour and the season, the German grid can emit anywhere from 8 to 14 times more CO2 per kilowatt hour than the French one. On average, across 2025, Germany emitted 328 grams per CO2 per kilowatt hour. France emitted 27. That is a factor of 12 on a yearly average. France has a stable grid, greater resilience to external shocks, and lower emissions. Germany's industry is suffering and its grid faces warring scenarios. But the French picture is not as simple as it looks. What is behind France's cheaper electricity? The truth is that to keep the lights on, Paris has used Électricité de France, its state-owned energy company, as a national credit card. For years, the French government has used ADF as a social safety net, accumulating a net financial debt of over 50 billion. But the real figure is even more profound. If we add the over 67 billion set aside for the future decommissioning of the power plants, we discovered that France's stability rests on a total liability of nearly 120 billion. And yet, a 120 billion euro debt with a stable grid and 12 times fewer emissions is a very different kind of problem from what some analysts estimate as a total cost approaching 1 trillion euros for the Energiewende, resulting in a grid that is increasingly fragile and vulnerable to the first serious climatic disruption. It is the tragedy of a policy navigating in the dark, sprinting toward an ideological goal while losing touch with the physical reality beneath its feet. There is a pattern in history that we keep failing to see, not because it is hidden, but because we only recognize it after the damage is done. In the 1920s, the invention of chlorofluorocarbons was celebrated as a triumph of safety engineering, replacing toxic, explosive refrigerants with a stable inert gas. That very stability was the flaw. It allowed the molecules to drift intact into the stratosphere and to begin destroying the ozone layer. Petroleum and natural gas were the great liberators. They replaced backbreaking human labor, prevented the deforestation of the industrialized world, and built modern civilization. They also initiated a century of carbon emissions, whose full systemic consequences we are still identifying. Asbestos was one of the miracle materials of the 20th century. Fireproof, cheap, abundant, it lined the walls of schools and hospitals before the link to mesothelioma became undeniable. The internet was designed to democratize knowledge. It did. It also fragmented social reality into a billion parallel universes, each convinced the others are lying. The Energiewende is the current chapter of this cycle. Conceived as a structural response to the carbon crisis, it is now generating its own cascade of unintended consequences: grid fragility, rising systemic costs, paradoxical dependence on the fossil fuels it was designed to replace. And its failure risks something beyond Germany: a negative precedent that fuels political movements indifferent to climate change and makes every future attempt at transition harder, more contested, more painful. Every solution contains the seeds of the next crisis, not because the people who designed those solutions were simply foolish or corrupt, but because complex systems do not behave the way our models predict. And we keep building models that are simpler than the world they describe. Germany didn't fail because it lacked seriousness. It failed because it applied a linear solution to a system that is fundamentally nonlinear. A system where removing one element doesn't simply create a gap to be filled. It triggers cascades, it shifts equilibria, it generates consequences that no spreadsheet had anticipated. And the institutions built to measure the transition had been designed by the same people who designed the transition itself. There was no independent mechanism of correction, no one whose job it was to say, the solution is wrong. This is not a German problem, it is a structural problem of how modern societies make decisions. Politics, by its very nature, cannot easily solve it. Politics doesn't plan, it reacts. It responds to the crisis in front of it, to the election cycles ahead of it, to the coalition that sustains it. Long-term thinking in a democratic system requires something extraordinary: a political class willing to defend decisions whose costs are immediate and whose benefits are decades away. That is a rare thing. Perhaps it always has been. The most telling evidence of this is not the data, it is who is now saying so. Ursula von der Leyen served as Federal Minister of Labour under Angela Merkel during the years when the nuclear phase-out was accelerated. She supported it, she voted for it in the Bundestag. Then, in March 2026, as President of the European Commission, she stood at the Nuclear Energy Summit in Paris and stated publicly that the phase-out had been a strategic mistake. Let me now be honest about what nuclear power actually is, because this channel doesn't trade in comfortable fictions, in either direction. Nuclear is not clean in the absolute sense. It produces radioactive waste, but the picture is considerably more complex and more promising than the public debate usually admits. Up to 96% of spent nuclear fuel can be reprocessed and recycled. France has been doing this industrially for over 40 years at Le Hague, the largest civilian reprocessing plant in the world. What remains after reprocessing, the genuinely irreducible waste, amounts to roughly 4% of the original volume. That residual material is vitrified, sealed in stainless steel containers, and stored. The total annual volume of final high-level waste produced by France's entire nuclear fleet, generating 70% of the country's electricity, is approximately 200 cubic meters per year, less than the volume of a modest apartment. With fourth generation fast neutron reactors currently under development in Russia, China, and elsewhere, even that residual can be transmuted, leaving waste that decays to safe level within 2 to 3 centuries. This is not science fiction, it is operational physics being demonstrated today. None of this means the waste problem is solved. It means it is a problem with a visible trajectory toward solution, which is a very different thing from a problem with no solution. On construction costs and timelines, here the critics are right to be cautious. The record of nuclear construction in Western countries over the past 3 decades is genuinely poor. Cost overruns have been severe. Timelines have stretched far beyond all projections. But this record is not uniform. France built 58 standardized reactors between 1974 and 1999 under the Mesmer Plan, with construction times averaging 5 to 7 years. South Korea has demonstrated the same principles in the modern era. China is doing the same today. The catastrophic overruns at Flamanville, Hinkley Point, and Bogtal share a common cause: a 30-year pause in construction that destroyed institutional knowledge, supply chains, trained workforces, and regulatory muscle memory. When France tried to build a new reactor after a generation of inactivity, it was starting again from near zero, at 21st century costs, with a 20th century industrial base that no longer existed. This is not an argument that nuclear is easy. It is an argument that the difficulty is not intrinsic to the technology, it is a consequence of the choices we made. But there is a deeper structural problem, one that physics alone cannot explain. Imagine two identical nuclear plants. Same design, same technology, same output. One is built by a government that borrows money at 4%, the rate a sovereign state pays on its bonds. The other is built by a private company that must convince investors to wait 15 years before seeing any return and must compensate them for that wait with interest rates at 10% or more. The International Energy Agency has documented the result. That difference in financing cost, not uranium, not the engineering, not the concrete, more than doubles the final price of every kilowatt hour produced. 60% of what a private nuclear plant charges you for electricity is not energy, it is interest. France, South Korea, and China built their fleets with public capital at low rates, and they built them on schedule. The Western failures all share the same structural condition: private risk premiums applied to infrastructure that private markets, by design, cannot price correctly. Power generation like roads, water systems, and public health may be revealing itself as a domain where the logic of quarterly returns and the logic of physical reality are simply incompatible. This is worth a much longer conversation. We will return to it. Small modular reactors may offer a different path, but the challenge issued decades ago by energy scholar Václav Smil remains unanswered, and here I quote him: "Send me an email when you see these marvels built on time, within budget, and in numbers sufficient to matter." As of today, the handful of operational SMR projects have overrun their budgets by between 300 and 700%. The tragedy of the Energiewende is not that the trade-offs were ignored. It is that naming them openly was never politically possible. No electoral system rewards a politician who tells voters this transition will cost you more for longer before it gets better. So no one said it. Not in Germany, not almost anywhere in the Western world. What we did instead was attempt a physical transformation of unprecedented scale while simultaneously embracing the liberalization of the energy sector and call it progress. We traded the old logic of the public good, where grids were managed for service and stability, for the logic of the financial asset, where every wire and every wind farm must first and foremost secure a private return. The German case shows us what happens when political ambition meets financial opportunism, and both ignore the systemic reality of energy. It is a warning that when we treat a vital necessity as just another market experiment, the bill always comes due, and it is always the citizen who pays it. Germany is not an isolated failure. It is the most visible symptom of a global shift in how we design, finance, and understand the power that keeps our world running. To understand why this is happening everywhere, from California to Australia, we need to look at the forces that are now baked into the very architecture of our modern world. And that is where we will go in the next video, because every solution contains the seeds of the next crisis. The only question is whether we plant them with our eyes open.